Hello and welcome to today's workshop on wildfires, floods, and hurricanes, inclusive emergency planning and response to disasters. My name is Melanie Bailey. I'm honored to be moderating these exceptional facilitators and experts. And I'm speaking to you from the unceded Mi'kmaq territory of Epiquet, Prince Edward Island.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm Guzmán. I represent Alberta here, and I'm joining you today from Okinstis, which is a Blackfoot term for where two rivers meet, the Elbow and the Bow River, otherwise known as Calgary. And also really grateful to be here today along such experts and to be talking about really important stuff. Thanks, Melanie. Back to you.
Today's learning event is part of a virtual workshop series organized through the Pathways to Prosperity P2P Network and Western University. They're well known for their annual conference in addition to this workshop series. This session is being led by P2P's National Standing Committee on Immigration to Northern, Rural, and Remote Communities. Thank you for joining us and being part of our next step in considering disaster response plans that support vulnerable communities when the unthinkable happens. Discussions will range from living through the ongoing tragedy in Jasper, reflecting on outcomes 1 year after the devastation in BC's Okanagan Valley, advice from those supporting vulnerable newcomer communities, insights from settlement providers after weathering multiple disasters, and advice from those working in Canadian and US disaster response organizations. Across different experiences and communities, there is one common theme: advanced preparation is needed. And I think that's why many of us are here today. We do recognize that those participating in the workshop may be personally impacted by what we're talking about today, and today's discussion may be difficult at times. We invite you, if that's the case, to take a break when you feel you need to step away from the conversation. And a reminder that today is just a starting point, a rapid snapshot across a variety of topics and experiences in disasters, vulnerable communities, and emergency response planning. Each speaker is providing brief highlights and insights, a starting point. And we invite each of you to take the next step in digging deeper, involving those speaking, involving those in your networks, to doing in-depth conversations and doing your own localized emergency planning. While we'll only briefly scratch the surface, this is the starting point. Today, we're going to follow the agenda. First, we'll do a roundtable of the speakers so you get to know the speakers. We'll move into the rapid panel discussion, 5 minutes of highlights from each speaker's perspectives, followed with a Q&A with questions prepared in advance. Please put your questions in the chat as well. We will try to get to them or respond to them after the session, and following with workshop reflections. So to get us started, we'll get to know our speakers here today. You've met myself and Crystal, so I would like to ask Doreen to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today from across the country. My name is Doreen Rosvold. I'm the manager of the Refugee Resettlement Program at KCR Community Resources in Kelowna, BC. We are in the central Okanagan and have experienced many disasters over the recent years. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Javier.
Thank you, Melanie. Hi, everyone. I'm Javier Robles. I'm working for KCR Community Resources here in Central Okanagan. I have been working for almost 5 years, supporting temporary foreign workers. Now I transitioned on BC NSP, more like a settlement worker. But I would like to share with you my experience during the McDowell Creek fires last year, right? Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Javier. Antoine.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Antoine Richards. I work with the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. That is an extremely long name, so we call it IDEAM for short. We're located in the United States, but we're a global 501c3 nonprofit that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really identifying ways to operationalize equity for underserved communities and populations globally. So We have resilience and outreach centers in Ghana. We have our headquarters in Atlanta, and I work out of our Tampa office, but we do a lot of work all across the nation and the globe to ensure that equity is instilled for the populations that need it the most. So happy to be a part of this conversation and look forward to speaking to you a little more.
Thank you. Jessica.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Kalman. I'm the Executive Director and Literacy Outreach Coordinator at the Fort St. John Literacy Society in Fort St. John, British Columbia, which is located in the northeast corner or Peace region of the province. We provide settlement, language, and community connection services for newcomers and advocate for the importance of diversity and inclusion in Fort St. John. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Kierstin.
Thank you, Melanie. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. My name is Kierstin Lundell-Smith, and I work as legal counsel research in the Research Center in Humanitarian Services at the Canadian Red Cross. I am a lawyer, but hopefully a friendly nonprofit one. And my focus is really on understanding the ways in which our legal frameworks around disaster can often contribute to disparities in outcomes, and trying to enhance thinking around that. So it's a pleasure to be here and hopefully share some insights.
Thank you, Kierstin. We didn't anticipate when planning for this session that we would have one of our panelists living through a disaster at this very moment, which is a humbling reminder. It can happen to any of us at any time. Doug, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you, Melanie. My name is Doug Olthof. I am one of two co-leads of the National LIP Secretariat Project, which is a project to facilitate collaboration between the roughly 90 local immigration partnerships in Canada. Prior to taking on that role, I was the coordinator of the Jasper Local Immigration Partnership, and I am still an employee of the Municipality of Jasper in my current role and a resident of Jasper. And that is really the main qualification that brings me to speak with all of you today.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we're going to move into the rapid panel now. We've grouped them into 3 themes. We'll start off with some personal stories and current experiences and insight. Our second theme will move into more higher level insight from some of our emergency response organizations, and then we'll go back down into the vulnerable communities and have an additional discussion there. To start us off, we're going to have Doug, if you could, Doug, I'll turn the mic over to you. We're going to start our rapid panel with discussion from Jasper.
Great. Thank you very much again, Melanie. Again, my name is Doug Olthof. I live on Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territory, also in the Jasper House Métis District. My home is on the traditional territory of the Denesa, Assiniwachi Winniwak, Assiniwachi Nial, Nahiawak, Anishinaabe, Secwepemc, Stoney Nakoda, Mountain Métis, and Métis peoples. It's been 32 days since I left home, and the acknowledgement of this land and of the people that have traditionally cared for it has really never meant more to me. I want to thank the P2P and the organizers of the workshop for this invitation to participate. It was 8 days after a firestorm ripped up the Athabasca Valley and into the town of Jasper that my friend Don Body emailed me and asked if I would join the panel. And I immediately agreed, trusting that in the ensuing weeks, I would learn enough about disaster recovery to say something of value to all of you here. And I hope that this will prove to be true. I'm not 100% confident in that, but we'll give it a go. As you can imagine, in those early days after an event of this kind, it was very difficult to start drawing lessons. Our thoughts were and remain wrapped up in concern for our friends and neighbors who have lost their homes, for the schools and daycares that will struggle to open in the fall, for the workers and business owners whose industries will go dormant for some indeterminate amount of time, and of course for our own homes, because even for those of us whose homes were somehow spared by the flames, we have concerns about smoke damage and freezers full of rotting food and potentially toxic dust and smoke in the air when we do return. So I can say that the one lesson that has already become very clear in all of this is that from the moment an emergency response is put into action, things move very quickly. And for those of us who are dedicated to ensuring inclusivity in the response and recovery process, this means that we need to be prepared to keep pace. In Jasper, we all knew that this was coming. When I moved to Jasper in 2017, the Athabasca Valley was already reeling from the influx of mountain pine beetle. For decades and perhaps even centuries, the high mountain passes that dot the boundary between Alberta and British Columbia had kept the mountain pine beetle on the western side of the Great Divide. But sometime in the early part of this century, a series of warm winters allowed the beetle to spread into the wide glacier-carved valleys that make up Jasper National Park. 100 years of expert fire suppression in those valleys had resulted in a homogeneous forest of lodgepole pine trees that provided an endless buffet for these beetles. And within a few years, huge swaths of the mountainsides were covered in red dead beetle-killed trees. Those dried up standing trees were explosively flammable, and a single tree ignited could produce flames shooting 30 feet into the air. And by this year, the Athabasca Valley and its offshoots was home to millions of dead trees. And so on July 22nd, when a bolt of lightning ignited one of them, the fire immediately began to grow very, very quickly. And 2 days later, on July 24th, a wall of flame more than 100 feet tall was moving towards the town Jasper. Those flames culminated in the formation of a literal firestorm, something called a cumulonimbus flammagenitus, or a pyro-CB, a storm created by the fire itself. And that storm ripped up the valley, producing 120 kilometer-an-hour winds that flung softball-sized embers ahead of it. Wildfire experts knew they could not alter the course of this fire, and so they evacuated, leaving teams of structural firefighters to save as many buildings as they could. And those of us whose homes are still standing today owe a huge debt of gratitude to those firefighters who stayed behind to protect the town. We knew this was coming, but the speed and the power of the fire caught everyone by surprise. And the rapidity of that fire, as it impinged upon the community, set the tone for everything that has come after it. From the fire response to the evacuation, the work that has gone into preparing the community for re-entry, and the beginnings of planning for recovery, everything has happened at a pace that far exceeded my expectations. It took less than a month to get from evacuation to re-entry. If all goes well, schools will reopen in 3 more weeks. Before long, cleanup operations will begin on residential properties that were destroyed in the fire, and we may see the beginnings of reconstruction before the winter sets in. The pace of the response is incredible, but it begs the question, is anyone being left behind? In every phase of the emergency, the re-entry, the recovery, there is a massive government apparatus, a coterie of disaster response professionals, a battalion of insurance adjusters, a mosaic of NGOs, and an army of armchair advisors who are immobilized almost immediately. In most cases, and with the possible exception of the armchair advisors, these people and resources are extremely helpful. Many of them have been through similar emergencies in other communities and know what steps need to be taken, what challenges lie ahead, what resources can and should be mobilized. But for the most part, the help that will arrive in your community after an emergency will come from outside the community. And the disaster recovery industry, if you can call it that, may not be at the cutting edge of the inclusion conversation. That is why it's vitally important for local actors who are familiar with the needs of the community and of marginalized or equity-seeking communities in particular to be involved at every step of the way. Over the past few weeks, I've been reading a lot of disaster recovery reports, disaster recovery frameworks from Australia, the United States, British Columbia, lessons learned reports from Fort McMurray, Slave Lake, and Canmore, and all of these documents show that the field of disaster recovery is developing rapidly and that it has adopted a holistic approach to recovery that gives equal consideration to the social health of a community alongside the physical reconstruction of homes, businesses, and infrastructure. And in some of that literature, particularly in the lessons learned reports, you'll find reference to communication in non-official languages and other indications of an underlying concern for inclusion. This is a positive development, but it cannot be expected that the disaster recovery professionals who arrive in the wake of a fire, a flood, or a hurricane will have a deep understanding of the barriers to inclusion that exist in a given community. To ensure that disaster response and recovery addresses the needs of the whole community, the effort needs to be locally driven and locally led. In the development of emergency response procedures, ensuring inclusivity is relatively straightforward. Most communities that face a significant threat of natural disaster will develop evacuation plans, emergency social service structures, and other supports. They'll conduct tabletop exercises to help prepare for the real thing. There are opportunities during this time to ensure that disaster response plans align with the value of inclusivity and a concern for marginalized or underserved communities that by now most towns and cities have adopted. What's more difficult is to ensure that the same concern for vulnerable populations is present in the development of re-entry and recovery plans that develop in the heat of the moment, if you'll excuse the pun. The pressures that come to bear on an emergency management team to reopen highways and railways, to allow residents back in their homes, to get businesses back up and running are immense. For many good reasons, there's real urgency to get things back up and running as soon as possible. The urgency, though, sits in tension with what is, in fact, a rare opportunity to address long-standing challenges, whether they be infrastructure problems or structural inequalities. It is vitally important that in the rush to get people back on their feet, we don't neglect the opportunity to ensure that everyone has a place to stand. That is why it's critical that people like yourselves become directly involved with planning and executing disaster response and recovery activities. Those plans and activities need to go beyond reacting to an unfolding emergency to planning, insofar as is possible, how your community will begin its recovery. Equally critical is for people explicitly focused on addressing the needs of vulnerable communities to be directly involved in the emergency response itself. This means taking up the necessary training to play an active role in incident command systems or whatever response structure will lead the response in your community. Many critical decisions are made within that structure in the days following a disaster, and if you are not part of the team, you won't know about them until they're already made. Having a seat at the table is critical. These are early days for Jasper, and I hope that in a year or two, I'll have many success stories to share with you about how the recovery from the Jasper wildfire complex has helped us build a more inclusive and equitable community. Ours is a privileged community, situated in a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a national park that means a great deal to millions of Canadians and citizens of the world. We are receiving incredible support from all levels of government and Canadians at large. And we have a wonderful opportunity to build back better. But if we do that and we succeed in that effort, it will be because we had the courage to address the exclusions and inequalities that existed in our community before the fire, and to take the necessary steps to ensure that they are extinguished once and for all. I want to just say thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I'm very happy to take part in the conversation, to answer any questions to the best of my abilities, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the panelists. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Doug. Living the experience right in the moment. I know all of us in Canada have been watching this on our with great sadness and concern, and so thankful to have you here today. And likewise, Doreen, we sat a year ago and were troubled at the devastation happening in BC where you lived. If you could, I'll transition over to you, Doreen, and if you could share a bit from your experience.
Thank you, Melanie. I want to start with 2003, so 21 years ago, when I first moved to the Okanagan. And a few months after I had arrived here, I was evacuated due to a firestorm similar to what Doug has just described, a wildfire that ended up destroying more than 300 homes. I was alone with my 2 teenagers, a dog and a cat, no vehicle. I didn't know the community. I didn't know anyone. And it was terrifying. I had no idea where the fires really were in relation to where I was, and what did that mean to me. I would, listen to the news. I would try to understand how close the fire was. So when I think of newcomer families, while I was new to Kelowna, I am Canadian born, so I wasn't new to Canada. So when I think of some of the most vulnerable newcomers who do not speak English, who again do not know the community, do not know the systems, they don't know anyone, I realize the importance of conveying information to everyone in our community, to being inclusive. Exactly a year ago, we once again experienced a firestorm, and again, similar to what Doug has already described, so I'm not going to go into those details. The McDougall Creek wildfire, where we saw 10,000 people evacuated over a 3-day period. 4 members of my team of 9 were evacuated, as well as several other staff and managers from KCR Community Resources. When we think of evacuation, we often think of a 72-hour period. We're sort of told to prepare for 72 hours, and that's what we think of. There's the initial evacuation, but then it can last for weeks. Many of our colleagues were out of their homes for weeks. They didn't know when they would be able to go back to their homes. They didn't know if they would have homes to go back to. So there was a great deal of added stress and strain on the community at large, as well as on our organization and other organizations who are in the position of helping the most vulnerable. So as we were also under additional strain, we saw increased needs from clients looking for extra support. And we found that a lot of what we were doing in those initial days and weeks was translating information just as quickly as we could into as many languages as we could to get the information out to clients, and then connecting with some of the most vulnerable clients that we work with to see, did they have connections? Where did they end up? Were they able to figure it out? I think it's really important that as we are looking at all of this, that we consider, yes, the newcomers and the most vulnerable, that we are presenting information in as many languages as we are able to, but that we're also considering that the very workers, the first responders, the frontline workers, the helping agencies, that we are also included in those numbers of people being evacuated and people being distressed and uprooted during that time. So I think it's really important that we consider this as we are, often in settlement. So settlement, for those of you who are not familiar with it, settlement and resettlement, we're providing services to people that have just arrived in Canada. Resettlement is for the government-assisted refugees. And so these are people who are probably the most vulnerable. They're coming from places like Afghanistan, from Syria, from South Sudan, and who also may be experiencing a great deal of trauma and have most of the time had no intention of moving to Canada. And now here they are, and they have, at the beginning, have very little understanding of our country, our culture, our language, our communities. So I think there's a lot that we need to consider as we are looking at preparing emergency preparedness. And I'm really happy to be involved in this conversation as we come together and pool our resources, our knowledge, our experience, and try to better prepare. Because over these 20 years, from 20 years ago, when I experienced the first fire in the Okanagan and the fire last year, I would like to say those were the only 2, but they certainly have not been. We've seen many fires. We've also experienced floods and other natural disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. In reflecting on this discussion early on, we noted that some provinces have experienced significant tragedies, natural disasters, and yet the documentation online in various service provider and government portals is still not translated. So we really have to use that moment, that urgency, and to keep that fuel going to make sure we are ready for the next emergency. Like Doug said, the speed and the power of the fire caught everyone by surprise. And I think that's what always surprises us, is that we think we're prepared, and it always exceeds our expectations. Doreen is coming from the settlement background, similar with me at Immigrant and Refugee Services in Prince Edward Island. We serve vulnerable populations. A hurricane came through at a devastation level we haven't seen. We couldn't even communicate in order to reach our clients. So how do we plan for vulnerable communities when we've lost cell service? When you get a text from someone that says, when you have an intermittent cell service and you get a text from someone that says their whole roof caved down, but then the cell goes offline again and you can't reach them and you can't drive anywhere because there's trees all over the roads and gas stations aren't working. So I think each of us have been impacted, but in your cases, it has been so severe that we have so much to learn from you. Thank you. So we're going to take a step back now and go to a higher level. We have two individuals here speaking who do work within emergency response organizations, each bringing a particular area of expertise. So we're first going to turn to Antoine, who brings both a across US emergency response perspective, but also global. Antoine, thank you.
Awesome, excellent. And again, thank you for having me. I'm operating on two screens, so it might look like I'm looking over here and then looking over here at the same time. So bear with me, but definitely glad to be here. So again, my organization, the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, or IDEM, focuses on working with underserved communities across the world, really with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're one of the few nonprofits where that is our mission, that is our vision, that is our goal. And we have 8 goals. We understand that, achieving equity, leveraging diversity and inclusion in emergency management, which can be a very rigid field, is not a one-step approach. So we really focus on taking every angle that we can to make sure that the outcomes that we want to see are the outcomes that the communities and the people that we serve need, not just locally, but statewide, nationally, and globally. As mentioned, we're US based, so we do a lot of work in the US. And again, we have offices in Africa as well with our recent Global Resilience and Outreach Center in Ghana. So we do a lot of work with the understanding that the impacts of climate and the increase in frequency and strength of disasters are really going to have disproportionate burdens on a lot of people. And we see that, and a lot of that is due to the policies that are in place, the programs that are in place, the systems that are in place. They're due to historical biases that have been around. So one of the things that we start to think about is what inclusive emergency management looks like. And in particular, we developed a toolkit around inclusive emergency management for immigrant and refugee populations. This was something that was a very important issue to us, and something that we wanted to really begin to look at. So as I go through this, I'm just going to highlight some of the key areas and, make note that this resource is also available on our website. It is free. It includes tools, checklists, and all of those different things that you can readily use and apply. But, there are really several key components to a lot of this when we think about inclusive emergency management. One of those is really understanding the community, right? Community assessment. How are we assessing the community? And I always encourage us to think about assessing the community, not only at a larger level. So in the US, we use census data to understand demographics and things like that. But to start to think about the societal trends and to start to think about how we can get below that census level data. Because many times we'll look at the community and we'll say this is a really good community or a wealthy county, but there are pockets within those counties that, experience those disproportionate impacts. There are a lot of different things that level of data doesn't provide. What is the specific community? Is there a Laotian community here? Are there fishing communities here? Are there refugee communities here that are working within these areas? And a lot of times they go missed if we don't really seek to get into the communities themselves. So I always encourage community level assessments. Very key to inclusive emergency management. So not only understanding the demographics, but actually interacting and engaging, conducting outreach and engagement with those communities, getting that perspective, getting beyond the numbers and actually understanding the context of the people that are there, understanding what their key issues are, both short and long term, and then thinking about how we can leverage our resources to truly create an impact there in an equitable manner, right? And have great decision-making. The other thing around that is building trust with those communities, whether it's newcomers, immigrants and refugees, as we may call them here, communities of color, low-income communities, rural communities, those with access and functional needs. It's always about building trust within those communities. There are a million reasons for communities to not trust us, right? A million reasons for communities to not trust us. And part of that is the fact that a lot of our policies, practices, and programs are exclusionary. By the design of them, they're exclusionary. So we have to be intentional about how we start to include the communities in that process. How do we build trust with those communities? How do we proactively engage the communities? How do we make them a part of that process? How do we leverage community-based participatory research for inclusive emergency management? How do we take them not only from the design of what we want to do, but also incorporate them into the implementation of it and the evaluation of it and the feedback loops of it, right? And actually take this to a different level. When we get past that, we want to start to think about inclusive communication practices. How are we actively engaging? Are we meeting them where they are? Are we communicating in their language? Do they have access? Are we navigating with the local barbers? Are we, barbers or salons? Are we talking to the people that are there? So I think a lot of that's really important. And one of the other things that I always focus on is evaluation. We don't do a good job of evaluation in emergency management. We do after action reports, we think about disasters and things like that, but did we truly evaluate the programs? Do we have the right metrics and measures for equity? Or do we have the right metrics and measures for how we're including those communities or how we're addressing the needs of immigrant and newcomer populations? So the last thing we have is really finding ways to build inclusive emergency management from within. A lot of times, those problems or the barriers to inclusive emergency management exist right within our own organizations, right in our own approaches, right within our own policies. And we have to start to really assess and address what that looks like to us and what it is that we want to achieve. And when we put all those things together, then we start to see that we can have more inclusive approaches that are actually meeting and addressing the needs of the communities that we serve, and that are actually more thoughtful about what the barriers exist are and how we can overcome those barriers in a way that is participatory and that creates equitable outcomes. So with that, again, the toolkit is available, and hopefully when Q&A comes around, if there's any questions, I'm happy to dig deeper and dive into some of the things I said, but I thank you for your time and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Antoine. Very practical. Community assessments, outreach, and engagement, working right with each of the vulnerable communities. Build the plan with them, inclusive communication in their own language, reaching them, and the disproportionate impacts that rural and regional and refugees and vulnerable immigrants and other vulnerable communities experience during these tragedies. Thank you. I'd like to now turn to Kierstin, Kierstin Lundell-Smith, lawyer with Red Cross Canada.
Thank you, Melanie. Let me say again what a privilege it is to be here and how I've been frantically jotting down notes from the other speakers, because it's been so wonderful to hear all of the experiences and insights that you bring. I'd like to try and build off a little bit of some of the things that Antoine said, just as a launching pad. Hearing you talk about being active in Ghana is something that we see as members of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement active throughout the world. We're increasingly seeing disasters and climate as a push factor, causing people or contributing to their decisions to make the migration journey. We're seeing disasters striking people as they're on the move. For example, parts of Central America are exposed to hurricanes, just as one example. And then we're seeing more displacement, sometimes double or triple displacement of people once they're here in Canada, because of course we have plenty of forced displacement due to disasters, as we've heard earlier speakers mentioning. I'd like to take a moment to talk about those exclusionary practices, policies, and procedures, and really focus it at the legislative and regulatory level so we can see what kind of background we're working with in emergency management to understand where those gaps might be and where that advocacy needs to happen and where we need to fill in as much as we can when we're trying to be more inclusive, rather. We really have a system that is jurisdictionally complicated, is not oriented towards newcomers' needs. The way that it works here is that the first responsibility is on the individual and on the family and on their immediate community, neighbors, friends who they can seek refuge with, because most people don't go to shelters when they're displaced. The first place they go is within their closer social networks where they can, and relying on their own savings or access to credit where they can. And then where that individual level is overwhelmed, we expect people then to go to local government. When that local government is overwhelmed, it goes up to the province. And then the province, when it is overwhelmed, can go ask at the federal level. And that's where policies about reimbursement of costs are set. So we have a model there that's very focused on property. It takes homeowners when it's looking at individuals as something of its default. And even when it looks at tenants, it's looking more at their property than at the more intangible losses of losing access to, say, transportation or daycare for your kids, or having fewer shifts because the restaurant isn't doing as well that you work at in the wake of a disaster. And so those kinds of losses tend not to be helped out as much, and that disproportionately falls on newcomers, who are twice as likely to be renters in their first 5 years in Canada as the general population. And renters are a little bit of a blind spot there too. So that's kind of the background that we have in terms of a legislative and a regulatory framework here, and helps explain some of the vulnerability that we see with more newcomers. We also have vulnerability based on legal status. For example, someone who's a seasonal agricultural worker and living where they work is not going to be as tightly knit with neighbors in the broader community that they could go and get help from. They lose their transportation, will lose their work. We don't have a dedicated disaster income replacement system at all. We have our general EI, which is not super accessible to lots of people in immigration statuses like temporary foreign workers. So the message that I kind of want to give as a takeaway here is that the bones of our system in a legal sense are not oriented towards newcomers. And that's where we need to have more advocacy. That's where we need to have more services and try to fill in those gaps, or even, I would hope, try to reorient our system to take the needs of people who have the least to fall back on as its priority.
Thank you, Kierstin. You brought up an important point, and that's the discussion around immigration due to natural disasters and climate change. And that story of overseas disasters causing people to move and then experiencing disasters while they're on the move, and then potentially experiencing a disaster in Canada. The twice as likely to be renters in the first 5 years, and all of the vulnerabilities you spoke to, and no disaster income. I hadn't thought of that. And you're right, there's EI, but of course it's not accessible for everyone. There's a lot of work to do to consider vulnerable and immigrant communities. Thank you, Kierstin. So we're now going to move into a more on-the-ground discussion, bringing it back to newcomers and the personal experiences and the reality of what these vulnerable newcomer communities may face. To start us off, I'd invite Javier to speak to us from his experience.
Thank you, Melanie. Yeah, during the McDowell Creek fire here in central Okanagan last year, so as a migrant support outreach worker, when the fire hit us, so we start receiving a lot of calls from temporary foreign workers, basically farm workers, who was in needs, was on a remote places, on farms, with no updates because they don't speak our language. On the news, they don't understand the English. They don't know what was saying on the news. Everybody was scared, trying to move, trying to being far from the fires, but they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. They live in places where the transportation is very remote. So until finally the employers take them like at midnight and tell them, okay, we have to move. We have to go into a safe place, take your belongings, whatever you had, and move, right? So they moved to another place that they didn't know it. No food, no water, no money, no work, and start asking us for support. So a lot of organizations who have low budgets trying to support them, right? With food, with water, and trying to fill at least his needs, but they just don't have needs as food or water. They need to support his family back home. All his family depend on them. And if they don't have work, they don't have money. So it's like another kind of anxiety and trauma for them. If we suffer trauma and anxiety when fires or any emergency hit us, but we know how to move, we know how to do, we know how to follow the rules, but the employers just take it from one side to another side and bye-bye, right? And at this time, at the same time, people from Kelowna or Okanagan Emergency Center calling us, like there's a lot of workers here on the shelters. Okay, we go to the shelters and they said, these workers don't want to tell us from which farm are they working, because apparently the employers was the one who has to evacuate his workers, right? But these workers don't want to release or relieve who was his employer. And when we start asking or digging what happened, there was tourists with tourism visa who come here to Canada to live the experience and work on the farms, right? But because they was working under the table, they doesn't want to relieve who do they work, who do they hire them, because they wasn't attendance on the fields, right? So a lot of workers get to the shelters, and it's very overwhelming. Like, try to support the workers that was evacuated and the workers that doesn't have anybody to support them. So it's a very, very extreme conditions, right? And even you have to be taking care of your relatives, right? Or your people, the people that you love. But you have to take a decision, right? You have to, okay, my family is okay now, they are in needs, we need to go and trying to support the best that we can. So I want to share with you that ones. And also, after the fires comes to the end, then due to the smoke and all the contamination, pollution, they wasn't able to come back to work. So they have to stay at the farms with no income, no work, and families depending on them. So it's a very, very, very complicated situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Yeah, those migrant workers, the farm workers, others, temporary foreign workers, you mentioned they're in a lot of different statuses and they're not visible. There might be visitors working under the table, tourists. Their immigration status may be based on their work, and now they have no work. Their family back home is surviving on their salary. Now there's no salary. They don't know what to do. They don't want to speak up. Just like Antoine said, there's a million reasons for people to not trust. And in this case, there is a million reasons, and they're fearful for their future and whether they'll be able to stay in Canada. So they may be in very, very vulnerable situations and aren't willing to raise their hand for help, or maybe to evacuate when they need to. Thank you, Javier. Jessica, coming from the St. John Literacy Society.
Thank you. Yes. So kind of bringing it back to the newcomers as well. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm from Fort St. John, which is in the Peace River region of British Columbia. And this area has been affected by wildfire situations for quite a number of years, but they have become more severe over the last couple of years due to, lack of precipitation and drought in their area, which seems to be spread across the province more regularly, unfortunately. So as a result of this, I've been both personally affected by wildfire evacuation alerts and orders, which was quite eye-opening for me and quite an emotional experience for our whole family. Luckily, we are very blessed not to lose anything or anybody, but it was still a turbulent situation for us to navigate. And then professionally, our clients have brought forward kind of an awareness that these types of situations, they add a ton of stress to an already sort of uncertain time along their settlement journey. Many of these newcomers are focusing on ensuring they have housing, ensuring they have jobs, ensuring they can care for and support their families. To add in an emergency such as a wildfire, where all of that is kind of uprooted, it causes even more stress. So this year, we also worked with one of our neighboring communities when they were evacuated to Fort St. John, as well as their clients, of course. So it kind of also brought another awareness that when others are coming to our community, how can we support them as they're basically experiencing the same thing that we did a year ago? So between these experiences and speaking to our clients and our staff, this has made me more mindful about some of the challenges that arise in these types of emergencies, and those are, to kind of go over them, very limited technology and internet for rural residents. So for example, if you drive 20 to 30 minutes outside of Fort St. John, there's no internet unless you have a satellite. So, I mean, last year when evacuation orders were issued, we have some clients that live an hour north of town and they don't have internet or really any technology. So it was us phoning them on the cell phone or on their landline to let them know that what the situation was. Otherwise, they would have had no idea. So that's kind of startling in itself. It's been mentioned already before, but language barrier is quite a large component to emergency planning. It creates a really stressful situation to be receiving these emergency alerts and having to learn the language to comprehend them at the same time. It's already stressful to be receiving alerts and having to uproot, but to have to, sit down and try and comprehend and understand what the alerts are saying, it's not good. And then being unaware of the area or the familiar routes, the back roads that are alternate routes, especially in the rural areas. So again, as an example, we had a group of individuals that when evacuations were happening said, we'll just meet you at the lookout. That's not super helpful, especially if you're not aware of the area or what the lookout is or what it means or where it is. And limited peer and social groups to lean on for help. So in situations where you do have to, evacuate and gather what you can and leave, not everybody can do that on their own. They might not have their own transportation. They may have animals that they're concerned about. And if you don't have the peer network group and you don't have the language to ask for help, it kind of puts you in the situation where you feel very isolated, lost, alone, and in a scary situation. So from my perspective, kind of overall, when thinking about, inclusive emergency plans, I feel we need to consider those that are in a new and possibly strange place with limited communication, possibly limited or no access to technology, and limited to no peer groups. So it really is kind of putting yourself, for a lack of a better example, kind of alone on an island with a fire all around you. What are you going to do? How can we support these individuals and help them not only navigate the situation, but set them up for success moving forward on the other side of the emergency, where they feel confident and comfortable to ask for help in the community, where they're well aware of all the services that are available to them and have a general idea of where to go in these types of emergencies. So that's kind of what I wanted to touch on. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, that is it. It's alone on an island with the fire all around you. What are you going to do? And it is true. That's the typical immigrant experience. You're new in an unfamiliar place. There's language barriers. There may be technology barriers. There's social and peer barriers, and you don't know what to do. Some of us even struggle to know what to do during an emergency, and then compounded on top of that is all of those barriers and challenges. And like Kierstin and Antoine had spoken to, is this increase in disasters. Just in the last year, we've spoken a lot about the enormous, shocking disasters that have been going on, some of what you've spoken about. And then there's even smaller disasters that pale in comparison, but yet immobilize communities. In the last year, the hurricanes and tornadoes in Ottawa, the water break in Calgary, the water main break in Montreal, fires in places. We heard of one in Newfoundland. Last year, we had a small fire in Prince Edward Island. Thankfully, they put it out, but it was our first glimpse at what could have happened. Rural communities do. We identify with the lookout, the purple house, or let's meet at that business, only that business's name changed 2 decades ago, and newcomers don't know that. that language or that terminology. Thank you, everyone, for painting that picture and bringing insights to us. We're going to have a chance to reflect a bit more now to really dig into some of these questions. For those on the call, please, if you are thinking of a question, if you could jot it down. For those able to stay, if we do go later, we'll open it up to you to ask those questions while we have everyone here together. So to start us off, I'll turn to Crystal. We'll move into questions. There's 4 questions, but within each question, there's a few questions. So if you need repeating the question repeated, please just let us know. I'll turn it to you, Crystal.
Thanks, Melanie, and thank you everybody again for sharing such personal stories and expertise and knowledge, and we hope to dive in a little bit more into that. And Melanie, thank you again also for your responses as well. For the first question, if we could turn to Jessica, Javier, Doreen, and possibly Doug. We talked a lot about the unique challenges that newcomers face during emergencies and natural disasters. And thinking of local governments, we talked a little bit about this as well. What advice or practical recommendations would you share with government and other organizations that lead emergency and natural disaster responses? So thinking about what they should consider when including newcomers in their emergency response plans. If you have any ideas or advice, dreaming, yeah, just jumping right in.
Well, I was really happy to hear Antoine, all of the information that you shared. And something that I had written down and thought of, and you spoke to this, is that the importance of knowing who is in the community. That's huge. And, and then, I mean, with language, can we provide everything in every language? Probably not. But for example, looking at the Central Okanagan again, we know that every year there are literally thousands of migrant workers in our valley, and the majority of them are Spanish speakers. So why would we not have all of this information translated into Spanish? It is translated into a few languages, but that's one example that I think is just, I think we can learn, and like we say, from past experiences, and be better prepared the next time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doreen. And just, yeah, thinking of who represents the communities, who is mostly there, that would be really an easy, not easy, but a very practical solution that's really feasible in a short amount of time to translate it to the languages that folks would need it in. Javier or Jessica, if you would like to share anything else either?
Yes, based on the previous experience that we had last year, we try to encourage all the another organizations to do workshops with farm workers, right? Visited on the farms, and not just talking about his rights, his benefits, his duties, but try to explain that about be ready for the next event, because the emergency event will come. So being prepared. Try to encourage the government. Like, I know BC Prepare has a lot of LinkedIn, social media, everything. Like Doreen said, why not include Spanish? If we know that, for example, in BC, every year come more than 14,000 farm workers who speak Spanish. It's not enough reason to get any articles in Spanish. I think is reasonable, right? And the barriers are the same ones. Don't speak the language, right? Live in remote places, so no transportations. They come with cellulars from his own country, because they use a platform that we don't use here, like a WhatsApp. This is the platform that they use to communicate with his relatives, with his family outside. But they are not able to make a call with these phones here in Canada, and maybe they are not able to understand on social media what they are talking about. So maybe the government can be more prepared in terms to get more languages, and trying to encourage all the other organizations to visit the farms, do workshop regarding these topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Yeah, you bring up some really good points. Having organizations or even the local government itself host some workshops at the farms or other places of work where temporary foreign workers are would be really awesome to see. And I know that most of us have smartphones and we usually receive those emergency alerts on our phones with our phone numbers. But it would be interesting to see if it's possible for government to also include WhatsApp numbers or have employers have their employees on some sort of roster and have that be a message sent out, possibly in Spanish or French, any other language that they have. But Spanish would be probably the most useful one. So thank you, Javier. Those are some really good ideas. Just a couple more minutes left if we have, anything else to add, Doug? Thank you. Yeah, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think moving beyond just the communications, which is obviously extremely important, one of the things to recognize is that building resilience to disruption, to emergencies amongst the newcomer population, it requires much the same thing that settlement work provides in terms of helping people learn how to navigate systems and build networks of social connection. Those two things are extremely important to helping people build the resilience to get through disaster. And so I think that's important to keep in mind as preparatory work for disaster recovery, but it's also another reason among many that the types of services that we offer to permanent residents in terms of settlement supports need to be extended to temporary foreign workers as well, because they will be affected in the same way by these emergencies and the same elements of resilience will be necessary for them. So extending those types of community connection services and help with navigating systems to all newcomers, regardless of their immigration status, would be a great way to help people prepare for this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doug. Yeah, we know that IRCC doesn't cover, settlement for TFWs, but it would be awesome to see some advocacy towards that. And I know that some organizations are working towards that, but it's something that we need to continue to push, especially as global warming is affecting everybody, newcomers, particularly as they're super vulnerable. And like you said, also instead of having the reactionary response to these natural disasters, it'd be awesome to see newcomers integrated and a little bit more socially connected in their communities from the beginning to help them out when they do have to respond to these natural disasters and have some connections already in place. Jessica, yeah, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add, a lot of the barriers have gone over already. One thing that was kind of brought to our awareness from one of our clients actually is some newcomers are unfamiliar with the response efforts and possibly reluctant to approach emergency personnel, such as, police or RCMP, given their kind of negative experience with law enforcement from their country of origin. So that's kind of another aspect that we didn't think about until people were knocking on doors to enforce the evacuation orders, is that the newcomers didn't want to answer the door because they were quite scared and didn't know that they could trust the emergency personnel that were coming to help them in their assistance. And then just the one other thing I wanted to add as far as what governments and other organizations could do to help is to ensure that there are translators or translation devices at the emergency response stations when they're coming to register. That was one thing that kind of was brought to light this year here in Fort St. John. And like I said, being mindful of some past trauma when dealing with law enforcement or emergency personnel and newcomers, because there is often that level of reluctance of, can I trust you? Is what you're telling me correct? Or do you actually have my safety in your best heart? So those are some things to also keep top of mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. You bring up a really good point. I know here in Calgary, we've seen some workshops hosted by, or orientations hosted by the Calgary Police Enforcement to go into newcomer communities and kind of introduce themselves, talk about who they are and how they can support. So seeing something like that in rural communities or otherwise would be really awesome to see to help build those relationships. Thank you. Doreen, go right ahead.
Thank you. Yes, just to build on that, in the refugee resettlement programs, I know this is something that we have implemented now as part of our orientations with government-assisted refugees, is that we have created, and we've taken a lot from Prepare BC website, around emergency preparedness, and we do incorporate that piece that Jessica was speaking to. What would that actually look like? How do you know you're evacuated? It might be the police at the front door, or if it's a gas line, break, it might be someone from Fortis, BC, or, or that. And so actually talking about what that would look like, because yes, many people are not going to be receptive to having, the police at their door. So I know this is something on a national level too. When I say national, I mean with the refugee resettlement programs across the country. We're discussing this, in great detail to really to offer these orientations right from the start for some of the most vulnerable newcomers to our communities.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Doreen. And that ties in nicely, I think, to our next couple questions here. For Kierstin and Antoine, just coming from an organization perspective, do your emergency management and emergency response plans consider newcomers, or how can we integrate newcomers in these emergency response plans? You can kind of tie in your own, the own phase that you're most familiar with, if it's preparedness, onset, response, recovery. If you have any insight about how to kind of include newcomers a little bit more, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
So I guess go ahead, Antoine. You can start.
No, ladies first.
So as the Canadian Red Cross, we serve everybody, but increasingly that is larger numbers of newcomers. And I think I'll take the spot to highlight some work that I wasn't involved in personally, that my coworkers have been supporting, where they've been part of the Inclusive Resilience Project, along with Partners for Action at the University of Waterloo. And I think that does get some funding from Public Safety Canada and involves some community partners. And it's a project with sort of 4 different phases that overlap with some of the things that Antoine was mentioning earlier. There's a research aspect to it. There's public awareness campaigns, community-based activities, and granting, and not all of these have taken place. But it's focused on having more targeted messaging for groups that tend to be underserved in emergency management. So that does include women, lower income folks, older adults, Indigenous communities, but one of the groups is newcomers. And so they've had some early findings that they're trying to build resources from as well. They have a few multilingual resources around preparedness kits for those 72 hours. But one of the things they've been finding is that there's often just a lack of awareness of the hazard risk among newcomers, because often people come to Canada and they feel like they're in a safe place, which is, of course, something we want them to feel welcoming here, but having that awareness that there are natural disasters and hazards here. They're also have found as an early finding that there's a bit more of an expectation that government is going to take care of everything and has a plan in hand to reach everybody. And that's very much not the case. And it's not what government is expecting to do, since the first responsibility officially falls on individuals, families, communities, neighbors. So some more targeted messaging around preparedness, and also making it look like the situations that people find themselves in. The older generic messages tend to look a lot like single family houses, and having brochures showing people prepared in high rises, for example, maybe a more helpful way to target, as well as getting the languages and using simple language in general to reach people with, some English or French understanding. So that's one way that we're trying to do better to serve these communities at an earlier stage in the disaster management cycle.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much, Kierstin. I think preparedness kits would be really helpful. And I think I heard you speak about this in the past. Things that include, like, what would an emergency response look like? What are the required documents that you need to keep with you? If you could have a fire safe sort of box where you have important documents so you don't have to replicate those or go through the process of replicating your driver's license, renter's insurance, for example, things like that. So what are the main things that folks would need during an emergency response? And that would be really awesome to see. Thank you so much.
And I'll
Antoine,
pop a link in the chat too. Sorry.
Perfect. No, that's awesome. Thank you. Antoine, go right ahead.
Yeah, happy to hop in here. And, I think the thing that that's interesting about emergency management is a lot of it is very rigid, right? It's the systems are rigid. Speaking from the state side, there's the national response framework. This is what we do in an emergency. There's the incident command system. This is how we structure emergencies. This is the organizational structure from it. We have, our incident commander, and then we have our logistics coordinator, and we have this person here. We have our admin. So there's a certain way that we are trained and taught to handle and manage disasters. And unfortunately, it's not always the most inclusive, nor it is the most equitable, right? There's not really a one-size-fits-all approach to disasters, and that's been one of the things that's been difficult within the field of emergency management. Granted, we handle disasters and the processes and protocols are in place for wildfires, for earthquakes, for hurricanes, whether it's preparedness, mitigation, response, or recovery, but a lot of them miss out on the key element or the key aspects of what inclusive emergency management is, or what that looks like in each phase of the cycle. So one of the things that I say would be really important in this, because the decisions that are being made for the people that are being impacted are not really inclusive of the people that are really, experiencing the burden of it, is to begin to think about how we can incorporate what inclusive emergency management looks like. Do we add equity advisors to the incident command structure, right? Do we come up with community-based panels and things like that? What are we doing in the blue skies versus the gray skies? A lot of times we don't take enough time in blue sky weather to make the partnerships and things that we can need, that we can use, that would actually help us improve response and recovery. Creating partnerships and relationships with community-based organizations, nonprofit organizations, faith-based organizations, with organizations like those on this call that serve newcomer communities, right? That are shelters, or that could be resources for those things if we had them in our arsenal and actually included them in our planning processes and procedures. So in a lot of ways, we have continuously operated in a way that has continued to breed inequities without change. And it's important for us to begin to think about how we can be intentional about that change. How do we include them in that process? How do we build the relationships and partnerships on the front end? Much with anything, if we have project managers on the call, you got to front load a lot of that stuff, right? You got to go in, develop your project management plan, assign your responsibilities, know where things are going. And that applies the same with disasters. How are we inclusively front loading? Or are we trying to do it all on the back end and then trying to figure out what we can do to help people because people are missing out? So just better planning, not even that plan, because ICS and all stuff is a plan, but that plan doesn't always work. It's better planning. How are we planning? And I think that's one of the best ways to get towards a more inclusive environment, especially when it comes to newcomers, incorporating them into that process in any which way possible. So.
Thank you, Antoine. I think you hit the nail on the head there. We prepare as much as we can for natural disasters, but then oftentimes we find ourselves reacting when certain groups are missed out on, or we see that vulnerable groups are not represented or thought of in these emergency responses. I know here in Calgary and in AAISA, the umbrella organization that I work with, we have a representative who is on the City of Calgary committee, part of a subcommittee called Emergency Response Wellness Team. Emergency Wellness Response Team, I think it's called. But if we can have, agencies probably have a voice or a seat at the table within their municipality, because I know every municipality has some sort of wellness response team, preparedness response team. Have somebody, a voice at the table that can represent newcomers, that can represent folks with disabilities, to have those inclusive practices embedded within, the local government's response team. I think something like that would be really useful. So thank you for bringing up that point, Antoine. I think here, let me just take a look at the time. Melanie, if you don't mind passing it, I'll just pass on the torch to you just to close up the last couple questions here. I have to jump off pretty soon. But thank you everybody for such thoughtful responses again, and sharing your time and your resources. This is really important stuff that we're talking about, and it's really awesome to see us collaborating together to represent and to share all this information. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Crystal. So for these last two questions, we won't go into detail, just surface level, your first instinct thoughts, and whatever it is, it doesn't have to be wrong or right. You are actually experts in the emergency response in your own way. So Kierstin and Antoine, what role do you think those of us that work with immigrant communities and vulnerable communities, what can we do to help emergency management organizations like yours And when you're ready to deploy your emergency response plan, how do we engage with you? How do we help?
I think honestly, a lot of it is just what we're doing right now, right? It's about awareness. There are a lot of organizations and things, and there's no way that I can know them all, absolutely no way. So opportunities like this really raise awareness of organizations that are out there, and this is the starting point to collaboration. So, I look at, panels like this and things like this as opportunities to say, all right, I do know this organization, or when I'm thinking about what it looks like for newcomers in a disaster or something's coming, I'll immediately say, let me reach out to Melanie, right? Let's get this perspective. Let me talk to Doreen. Let me get with Javier really quick, because all of these things are kind of in place. Let me talk to Kierstin, because I know she's here and she has this insight. You begin to create a network of collective impact. And that's one of my favorite words, collective impact. We're coming together for a common and shared agenda and goal. We have a strong support network. We have objectives and goals that we all want to achieve, because ultimately we all want the optimal outcome, right? I don't think that and just in working with government and things like that for so long, a lot of times you find that nobody wants to intentionally be inequitable, right? Or they really want to help the most that they can, but they're bound by the system or the program that they're working in, or by resources. I don't have the money. I don't have, it could be a number of things. So I think one of the most important things in terms of this question is to begin to think about all that we have at our hands in these opportunities, because they raise awareness, but they now begin to create partnerships and collaborative opportunities for us to leverage each other, because I am not an expert on everything, but I know the people that are. And it's important that I include them in that process. So I think this is just a great example of that. And thank you for putting it together.
Thank you. Starting right now, create your network of collective impact, bring the people around the table, then you have each other to work with in planning and later when emergencies happen. Thank you, Antoine. Kierstin.
Yeah, I think that was super well said. I couldn't have put it better. It's creating those relationships ahead of time. And to echo some of what Doug said earlier about all that work that you do creating social links and helping connect people to things in their communities also helps build disaster resilience. And just the fact that disasters are on the mind of so many people who have attended this today, I think is a huge, huge helpful step towards that.
Thank you. It's so practical and simple. Just that's your first step. Reach out, have that discussion. Thank you. So very briefly, Doreen, Jessica, Antoine, if you'd like to weigh in. If the sky was the limit, like there were no barriers with who we can work with, who we can't work with, like what can immigrant serving organizations do to support the preparation and resiliency of newcomers to emergencies and natural disasters? Like what can we do right now to support our immigrant community in preparation for disasters?
I can start here. So a couple of the things that we've been doing here and have been working quite well are informing newcomers of the community about the gathering spaces in our region and in our area, preparing them with knowledge of what to do in possible emergencies or natural disasters. So, for example, what we've kind of implemented here is, when winter is coming to an end, we do a wildfire preparedness class with our English students. When summer's coming to an end, we do what to do in cold, harsh winter climates, because often newcomers are coming here who've never experienced winter before. And it can be, just as detrimental as extreme hot and fires if you're not used to -40 and walking around in flip-flops and no gloves. Increasing community connections with clients to make sure that they're well informed about all the services that are available to them in our community should an emergency happen. So, who is responsible for housing? Who do you go to when you need, access to food and shelter in an emergency situation? Those types of things, and assisting in translation of posted materials and alerts, making sure to contact the clients and provide the translated updates in the language that they're speaking. Because like I said, learning the language and receiving and comprehending the alerts at the same time are just not a situation that really anybody should have to handle or to navigate. So really just advocating for the clients, making sure that, they know that we're here for them in a stressful or emergency situation. A couple years back when we had fires, one of the first times with many of our clients, we were on the phone just sort of, I would say, cold calling them, I suppose, and letting them know, hey, this is happening. Do we know? Is there anything we can do from you? Same thing with the onset of, when COVID was just coming to service, that was an emergency as well. Just doing those check-ins with our clients, really treating them as our friends and our community members, and being there as a support network. But further to that, like I said, making sure that they understand the area, the location, the alerts that are coming out to them. And that's really sort of helped us set our clients up for success. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that, Jessica, and I'll go ahead and hop in here. I definitely think creating the opportunity for them to advocate for them is important as much as it is to allow them the space and empower them to advocate for themselves as well. I guess for me, when I look at this, and I put it in the chat, but if the sky's the limit, then reach for the sky. I kind of leave it here, but I say that with me, the answer is never no, it's always how. So there is always a way. We get a lot of no's in our lifetime, never enough how's. And I think a lot of times we don't put a lot of effort into thinking about how it can work. We're just very quick to say, this isn't going to work. So I encourage us all to be very intentional about what we're doing. Think about the how of the situation, and then, reach for the sky and make it happen.
Thank you. A lot to think about there. I was just reflecting, Jessica, when you were speaking, you had said earlier when you made a call to alert them to an emergency, you reached someone that had no idea it was happening. You said that was startling. So, that reminder that some people don't have an idea what's happening, and then the language barriers prevent them from learning more. And then back to Antoine, the sky's the limit. Just pull people together, have that discussion. And that fits Rodell in the York region. He said, in the larger centers, like there's emergency, he activates the response. So I think our smaller centers can really learn from the big centers about how do we activate that response? How do we keep our communication open with Red Cross and with government emergency responses and with other providers that support vulnerable communities? And back to Antoine's point is to start that, to have that conversation so we can activate that network. So with that here, we're going to wrap up this section, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end for those that can stay. Before I wrap it up, we'll turn to Doug to weigh in. Then we'll turn to Javier to give us some reflections from what we've been talking about today. And then that will close the formal portion of the workshop. And then we'll invite everyone to stay for an open Q&A. Doug?
Thanks, Mel. Sorry, I've been having issues with devices, so I've been in and out a little bit for the last minute. But I just wanted to, in that question about how immigrant serving agencies can begin preparation to support newcomer populations in the event of an emergency, I guess I'll just throw in a plug for the local immigration partnership, if that is something that exists in your community, because one of the things you'll want to do will be to connect with employers and to connect with service providers in the community, so that all of the various perspectives of folks who work with newcomers on a day-to-day basis can be integrated in the emergency planning process. And so that also by developing that network of connections, there are avenues for communication when an emergency does arise. Employers will know who their employees are. And so if you're trying to connect with people, that's a good avenue to go down. So I would just say that, and this is in some ways a response to a very well-informed question I saw in the chat from Heather Young-Leslie, who clearly knows Jasper very well, about all these different agencies that exist in the community and how they might be integrated in supporting the newcomer population, is that having that sustained collaboration and conversation in the time leading up to a disaster, in those blue sky periods, as Antoine put it, having those conversations ongoing will set the foundation for the types of collaborations and partnerships that will be needed in the response. So build those collaborations early.
Thank you for that reminder. There's local immigration partnerships across Canada. I'm part of it through AAISA. we are conveners. We can bring partners together for discussions to catalyze next steps. So a great next step for all of our local immigration partnerships across Canada is to step into this, as Doug said. Thank you for that reminder, Doug. Javier, I would love to have you just share some insights and reflections, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melanie. My reflection has to be going on this way, like how or who is a newcomer being prepared for unexpected emergencies, right? Who knows they are missing? Who knows to look for them? I think it's a very big, oversized bag that organization has to carry on. We need more support. We need more budget. We need more help from the government. Also, from my side on the sector that I support, migrant agricultural workers are not a small and insignificant population workers in Canada. In 2022, we get 70,000 temporary foreign workers who come here to Canada. So I think they need at least to get adapting housing for extreme weather, increase workers' access to multilingual educations, and address the fundamental precarity of migrant agricultural workers by creative, accessibility, and equitable pathways for permanent status on temporary foreign workers. I think this is my conclusion.
Thank you. Bringing it right back to the most vulnerable, the invisible, 70,000 across Canada. Thank you. I want to thank the ones that through P2P and that set this in motion. Natalia for all the work she did organizing, and for each of you that spoke today. When we first heard about this session, I reflected on some experiences, but felt both inadequate to be part of this discussion, and also curious about what I could really do. So I'd like to thank all of you for helping move the needle on this discussion. I'd like just for a moment, if each of us could reflect within our own area of work, what we can do, what you can do as a next step. And as we've heard, it isn't as complicated as we may think. Sometimes it is just that next step of immediately pulling a meeting together. But in your reflection and thinking about what your next step is, I just encourage you to take the urgency of the now, the experiences we're hearing about, and use that to fuel you to do something now and not wait until later. All of the speakers said that when later comes and the emergency comes, it's too late. It catches people by surprise. And so I'd like to thank you for what you've offered to us here today very much. So with that, we'll transition just to open things up. We invite those that can stay to just stay and let's just have a more open conversation. I know some questions were in the chat. I invite you to unmute yourself, put your hand up and ask your question, and we'll go through that question for a bit of time and then transition ourselves onto our next steps that each of us are determined to do now. So just to open that time up, I'm going to invite the audience to open your mic, like I said, and put your hands up. And while you're doing that, I just want to actually turn back to you, Doreen. I'm wondering if you have any other reflections. I know there was a number of questions. You've led a settlement organization for a few decades now. You work with government-assisted refugees, which are another highly vulnerable community. And just from any of the questions and discussions, if there was any last thoughts or reflections from you as well.
Thank you, Melanie. Yeah, I would just come back to what we've sort of touched on is the importance of building those connections, because sometimes when we're working with vulnerable populations, it's very easy to become the lifeline, with government-assisted refugees with my program, with Javier, with the migrant workers, and we can become that lifeline. And that's all well and good until an emergency happens, and suddenly we're now looking at our own families. So I think it's really, really important to connect people to as many other people and organizations and give them the tools and the know-how on how to find those emergency resources, to know where to go, so that we aren't the lifeline for all of these vulnerable people.
Thank you. I just wonder here, it is hard to look at the questions because the chat, we've been busy on the chat. So I did find one question that stood out to me here, and I'll keep looking for more. Would it be possible to partner with an organization like Red Cross Canada and create a multi-language volunteer-based emergency contact support center for newcomers with a hotline and promote immigrant services and organizations and libraries coast to coast? So I guess there's actually quite a few good ideas in there. So I guess the first is a simple, can we partner with Red Cross Canada to help create multi-language information about emergencies? And can we work with you to educate the communities at large about where to go for services within their communities, whether immigrant serving or others? So I'll turn that to you, Kierstin, obviously.
Sure, and I'll give a very quick and not in the short term super satisfying answer of I would love to follow this up offline, and I'm gonna take it with me as soon as I hop off this call, and hopefully be able to get in touch and report back.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be wonderful. After this call, the resources will be shared, and I think they mentioned the discussions will be shared. We'd appreciate that, Kierstin. I think what I learned from York is they have a really strong connection with Red Cross that they activate in an emergency response. And, maybe how can we do that? How can we, in other regions, work with Red Cross? I'll read one last comment, and then we'll invite each of you to turn your cameras on and put your hands up to ask questions. And if you don't have the time now, that's fine. But this will be my last question, and following that, we'll work to adjourn. It was a comment from Daria. I believe that closely collaborating with cultural organizations is crucial for effectively supporting immigrants and newcomers in emergency preparation. And I just wanted to echo that, and I think each of the speakers echoed that as well. There's a number of service provider and charitable organizations. There's also cultural organizations in place. And how do we work with them to develop our emergency response alongside them? Doug?
Thanks, Mel, and thanks for the question, the comment. I agree that it's very, very important. I think the important thing to keep in mind as well, though, in the context of small and rural communities, is that those ethnocultural associations and organizations don't always exist. When you have very small populations of particular ethno communities, they may not have the sort of critical mass to develop a formal organization or to have a clear structure. And so in the short term, that means that you might not have those particular organizations to partner and to rely on. In the longer term, that might be something for us as a sector to work on. And that might also, to bang on the drum of local immigration partnerships, again, be something that local immigration partnerships in small communities could think about. Working with ethnocultural communities to develop organizational structures, perhaps multicultural associations if the individual populations of ethnocultural communities aren't large enough to sustain an organization, but to put in those types of structures to help that develop so that in the event of an emergency or just in the regular operation of a community, those organizations exist to support newcomer communities and to be a source of connection in the type of collaboration that we need and for many different reasons in communities.
Thank you. I'm going to read 2 takeaways that came in through the chat. When I'm done of that, I'll just invite our speakers who have given up so much of their time to be here today. If there is any last line of wisdom or a bit of a takeaway, perhaps the next step that you've been thinking of. So from the participants, 2 takeaways. One was a reminder to all of us that translating emergency management resources is important. It's important to translate emergency management resources, but also how are we going to make sure immigrants can access those resources? Are we sharing them where they're able to see them? And are they in an accessible format? And that gets back to the struggle that many in our sector have struggled with, is how to get the information needed to the immigrant communities, because our modes of communication and the social media and other areas of communication we use are not the same in other cultures. So an important reminder, translate resources and then find out where those resources will be seen by the vulnerable communities. And then also a reminder that we've talked a lot about informational workshops, convening partners to talk, getting things translated into other languages, and also a reminder that we are working with very, very vulnerable communities. We've talked about the temporary foreign workers. We've talked about farm workers, which are TFWs. We've talked about government-assisted refugees. There's all kinds of other people with disabilities. And just a reminder, there's some complex challenges. One person that joined us works with immigrant and refugee women and children impacted by family violence. So there's highly vulnerable communities we're working with. They require all levels of support. So while we're creating our emergency response plans, let's consider our vulnerable communities and then our exceptionally vulnerable communities as well. With that, thank you all for joining us. Kierstin, any last words you'd like to share with us?
I just want to say thank you again for including me in this. I think it's an incredibly valuable forum for sharing experiences and making those connections. And I'm looking forward to us becoming a more equitable country in emergency management going forward.
Thank you. Doreen.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I really just want to say, let's keep the conversation going, but let's not just keep it at the conversation level. Let's start implementing what we have already learned and just keep going from there. Thank you.
Jessica.
Thank you for having me here today. It was a pleasure to be on a panel with such experienced and knowledgeable individuals. So thank you for including me, and I look forward to moving this discussion further, not only in a community and municipal atmosphere, but nationally and provincially as well. Thank you.
Javier.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor for me being here and sharing my experiences and my ideas. I think one of the best ways to support temporary foreign workers is create a networking, that all the organizations being in touch together in the area when the emergency occur, right? Because when one organization is just by himself, it's more hard, right? There's no enough budget, there's no enough resources. But when multiple organizations union and being together in order to support the more fragile workers, it's important to being together, optimize resources. I think is my last thing to say.
Stronger together, put the competitiveness aside, work together to collaborate on this. This issue's bigger than all of us. Thanks, Javier. Doug, any final takeaways?
Yeah, thanks. I really just want to say, express my gratitude to all of my fellow panelists, for everyone for joining. I think we are at a stage as a country and maybe globally where we are building this emergency response strategy from the ground up. In Canada, we don't have a national disaster recovery framework that's in development. We are in a position, I think, as a sector to inform, again, from the ground up, how we prepare ourselves to support vulnerable communities in disasters. And we are also very unfortunately at a point in history where we can expect more of these disasters to take place. And so it's very, very important that we learn from each other and we share what we've learned in our experiences to help develop that. And for me, and the experience of Jasper, sort of really in the midst of it right now, we've already learned so much from all of you who have been through this and who have shared with us and who have prepared reports and the lessons you've learned from all of this, and through conversations like this one. I just want to express my gratitude for all of that, and my hope that we will all manage to bring the lessons we've learned together and develop basically a framework for other communities to be able to respond more nimbly and effectively to disasters that will sadly visit us in the future. So thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to participate.
Thank you, Doug. We are, like you said, we're in a place in history where more disasters are happening. Many communities have been crippled, and our immigrant communities are vulnerable. Each of us, I just do a call to action to each of us to take that one next step. For me, it's calling Red Cross, pulling a few people together, start that conversation. Thank you to each of you for your advice and for giving us the energy, the focus to take that next step. So thank you. And with that, we'll adjourn the workshop. We appreciate your time here, and to each of you, we hope to continue the conversation. Please reach out. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone.